Well, good evening. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Boris Worm. Boris is presently on sabbatical leave from the biology department at Dalhousie University in Halifax. Both his master's and his PhD degrees from the University of Kiel in Germany. And Boris first went to Dalhousie University as a postdoc in the year 2000. And at the time, he was doing experiments on the rocky intertidal shore, and he was examining the relative importance of resources and consumers in maintaining biodiversity on the rocky intertidal. And that time at Dalhousie, those were formative years for Boris, because he realized that the processes that are important for maintaining biodiversity in the small scale, on the rocky intertidal, could be scaled up to the world oceans. So working with the late Ransom Myers, Boris expanded his perspective of marine biodiversity to the global oceans. And Boris shares Ram's passion for marine conservation, but unlike Ram, as you'll see, Boris has yet to grow the full shaggy beard that Ram sported. But anyhow, this global perspective on marine biodiversity led to several papers in prominent journals, which very much focused attention on marine conservation. And it also brought a certain measure of controversy as well. So the title of Boris's talk this evening is Saving the Blue Planet: Patterns, Trends, and Prospects for Marine Biodiversity. So please join me in welcoming Boris Worm to the University of Rhode Island.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thanks for coming here. I know there's better things to do, sitting outside, sipping a glass of wine, so I really appreciate you taking the time, being here with me. This is what my talk's about. I'm fascinated by marine biodiversity. To me, it's the biggest thing we can study on the planet, literally, as more than 90% of the biosphere is the ocean. And if I had to sum up what I'm doing, if I had to give it a headline, it would be this: discovering a changing ocean. And for me, that has two major themes. One is discovery and the sheer joy and fascination of unraveling something that's as big and powerful and sometimes mysterious as the ocean is. And then the other theme is the change we see in the ocean occurring from day to day, year to year, over decades and centuries. And then also the role we play in that change. So one is a innocent and happy theme, and the other is a more applied and somewhat more laden theme, where I sometimes feel we're studying this thing as we're starting to take it apart. It's like driving a car, but you've never been taught to drive that car. You're just discovering you're driving it as you bumble along, and then you start throwing out things like steering wheel, what's that for, windshield wipers, and the headlights go out, it's at night. That's sometimes how I feel, and we're kind of frantically trying to understand how this thing works, that for one reason or another we seem to be in charge of now. So I chose this picture to start with because it represents what I love to do most, being on board of a ship or stumbling along a shoreline and just observing and trying to understand what's going on. So this is the SSV Siemens. It's a ship that's run out of Woods Hole, actually, not far from here, by the Sea Education Association. And they run these cruises for students and faculty to discover things about marine biodiversity. Particularly, this ship operates in the Pacific, and I was fortunate to go on 2 cruises with Stanford University. These are some of the things that I would see on a cruise like this. Just the bewildering array of different species and life forms in the ocean, a much more rich and varied assemblage of different life forms, evolutionary types, than we see on land. And when I'm doing that, when I'm sailing through these oceans and observing and collecting things and trying to understand things, I also try to reflect on how it came to be what it is now, this incredibly rich ocean. And I think about the present, the past, and the future. So let's look at the present first. And it's not a coincidence that these are also the themes of the Census of Marine Life. This is a map we just generated about a week ago, 2 weeks ago. That's part of the Census of Marine Life synthesis project on species richness and diversity. And what it shows is, I think, the first synthetic image of marine biodiversity and where most of it actually occurs. So what you can see right away is that large parts of the ocean, particularly the open ocean, have relatively few species, as it's a rather hostile place to a lot of life forms, which are more tied to the coastal areas. Particularly in this region, in Southeast Asia, we see large hotspots of species diversity. And then here in the Southeast Indian Ocean, the Caribbean, throughout the Pacific Islands, and then attenuating away from there, the Eastern Tropical Pacific, the polar seas, relatively poor in species. The species represented in this map span all 10 orders of magnitude in body mass, from tiny foraminiferan zooplankton, which are actually a form of amoeba, all the way up to the largest whales. It's not always been like that. The past was somewhat different. Right now we have the richest marine biodiversity we ever had on the planet, according to the fossil record. But it has been a bumpy road up to here. There have been several prominent mass extinctions, the worst of which was about 250 million years ago, where it's believed that 90 to 95% of marine species went extinct, probably due to a catastrophic overturning of ocean circulation, maybe outgassing of methane hydrates, aspects of climate change. We're not really sure what caused it, but it was sure a cataclysmic event. So we have had great changes in marine biodiversity before, and the fear is that we are going to see similar changes in the future due to our own impact, through the combined effects of fishing, other ocean uses, climate change, ocean acidification. The fear is that we're impacting marine biodiversity in a very deep way, that we're only trying to unravel as it happens, as we're discovering these things. The point I want to make today is that this future is by no means certain. This is a scenario, and there's other scenarios that are much more palatable, and I think we should steer in that direction. But we have to do it consciously and with determination. My favorite view of the planet is, this is the Pacific Ocean. You see almost no land, it's all water. The cruise I took was from about here to here, last year, from Tahiti to Hawaii. When people ask, why should I care about this? Why is marine biodiversity important? Why does it matter to me? I go through a series of simple exercises. Sounds a bit like yoga. It's about breathing deeply, once, twice. And then thinking about the fact that that second breath came from the ocean, because half of the oxygen we breathe is produced in the ocean, as half of the planet's primary production occurs there. Also, when you breathe out, you produce carbon dioxide, 40% of which is absorbed by the ocean, which is pretty important. Also, a lot of us enjoy seafood, and there's more than 1 billion people on the planet who rely for their animal protein to a very large extent on seafood. And then finally, I think the ocean is for all of us, particularly if we live near us, a source of inspiration and joy that we don't want to lose. So this can be conceptualized, I think, in this simple diagram where we're trying to understand how we as a society change marine biodiversity at various levels, and how that will affect the functioning of the ecosystems that are driven by those species that we're impacting. And then how that affects those particular functions, or they're sometimes called services, that are important to us, such as good water quality, seafood tourism, and the resilience of ecosystems, the innate ability to absorb stresses and disturbances, some of which we impose, some of which are natural. And then this flows back in a feedback loop to us as benefits, benefits that we can quantify ecologically and also economically. So the idea is that whatever will eventually feed back to our own society and have implications. And I think it's our responsibility as scientists to quantify those implications and make them really clear, so we can learn to steer that car in a direction that we would like it to go, and not in just any direction or off a cliff. By the way, is this microphone working well?
No.
It seems a little bit echoey.
If you turn your head, it doesn't work.
Should I maybe bring it down a little? How's that? Better? Okay. Glad we figured that out. Okay, so to continue, this was the long-winded introduction. What I want to talk about is these three things: biodiversity loss, as we can document it today, which is a very limited first look at what's happening, the ecosystem consequences of that, and then the last part, which I call choosing the future, which is more about solutions and about steering the car in the right direction. So, talking about biodiversity loss, I gave an interview this morning about this particular species, bluefin tuna, and this other species, humans, which are affecting each other in interesting ways. And there's a conference going on right now in Doha, of all places, in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, about the future of this species, basically determining whether we can save the species from extinction through a CITES listing. I've been interested in these large fish for a while. Work I did with Ransom Myers in determining changes in their abundance over time. This included species like bluefin and other tuna, and large billfishes such as swordfish on the left and marlin on the right. Apart from changes in their abundance, which are relatively well documented and understood, I was interested in their pattern of biodiversity. It turned out that there was a very rich pattern of biodiversity for these large predators in the ocean. And the question was, has it been changing over time? Can we detect any impact or any directed change in the diversity of these species? So what this map shows is the species richness expressed as a number of species per a certain number of individuals, in this case 50 individuals. So imagine you go fishing and you pull out 50 individuals at random. How many species would there be? 1, 2, 3, 5? So it turns out there's parts of the ocean that have a lot of species in them, just as the previous map I showed for many species groups. This is just for tuna and billfish. And then there's others that are relatively poor in species. And what we can show is that over time, this is in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, there's a dimming out of species richness. We have, we can track the decline in the number of species per a given number of individuals. So this doesn't track changes in abundance. It's actually completely separate from changes in abundance. It may have to do with declines in abundance that are independently documented, but this is a number of species per certain number of individuals. So that's not so good. We were concerned about this and trying to find out further why this is. What is happening? Are we losing species from particular regions? Are some species becoming more dominant? That's ongoing research. I'm really interested in one aspect of this, and I want to share that with you today. It's research that's ongoing, but it's about the loss in, or the change in ranges of these large predators. So on land, there's a number of large predators that we're very familiar with, such as bears, wolves, foxes, bluebill lynx, and then also some other large animals, herbivores in this case, such as elk and musk oxen. Now, what we see here is their historic range, which is all the colored in yellow and red, all the colored areas here. And then their present range, which is just the yellow. And then in green is areas where they've actually expanded their range northwards, possibly as climate warms and habitats further north become more suitable for those species. So you can see, particularly the large carnivores have lost a huge fraction of their range. Black bears once extended all the way to this coast, and they're now rarely found directly on the coast, although they still occur in the Appalachian chain. Cougars were present here, not anymore. So the question was, these well-documented range losses in large terrestrial predators, do they extend to the ocean where things are thought to swim around more freely and maybe be more diffuse? So this brings me back to the bluefin tuna, because it's a species that we know has declined a great deal. These are ICAT stock assessment of the western stock. These are the animals of this coast. And this is the eastern stock, which resides in the eastern Atlantic and the Mediterranean. And you can see both of these have declined greatly in abundance just since 1970. They were already at maybe half of their unfished abundance at that time, and they've declined a great deal since then, as much as 85% for the western stock and about 70% for the eastern stock, just since 1970. These are the catches, by the way. You can see the reason for this decline in this case is that catches have been ramping up. And even as the species continue to decline, catches have stayed the same or even recently increased. And when catches get into the same order of magnitude as biomass does, that's a recipe for collapse and possibly even extinction. So that's why these stocks are under intense scrutiny right now as we speak. So the question was, on land, we see things that decline in abundance also have what's called a double jeopardy, that they decline in range. So they become more vulnerable to extinction because they're found in fewer places. The question is this also happening in the ocean? And the answer is yes, in some cases, particularly for species that have declined a great deal, 90% or more in their abundance, such as northern bluefin tuna. So bluefin tuna, Atlantic bluefin tuna, is called northern bluefin tuna because today it occurs in the North Atlantic. They actually migrate back and forth between our region here and the East Atlantic, go in the Mediterranean to spawn. Some in our region spawn in the Gulf of Mexico. That's the present distribution. The past distribution, this is from pelagic longline records, shows clearly, and there's many, many independent studies that show this, tagging studies, fishing records, and so on. The species occurred all over the South Atlantic as well, but not anymore. The range has declined to a fraction what it was once was. There's also areas that are not fished by this particular fleet, such as the Black Sea, the North Sea, and the Baltic Sea, which also used to have populations of bluefin tuna that simply don't occur there anymore. So the message from this is that, yes, we don't see any difference between land predators and marine predators in how changes in their abundance affect their range, and that, yes, indeed, they can be completely absent from very large areas of the oceans after they've been depleted. This is just independent data by Barbara Block of Stanford, who has tagged thousands of tunas off this coast, shown that they migrate freely back and forth, so the two stocks that are managed separately are in fact not separate. But the important thing for me here is to see that none of them ever went south of about 20 degrees north, whereas previously they clearly occurred in this region, so it was possibly a different stock that just did different things, and that stock's not there anymore. But it's not the same for all species. It's different. Species that haven't declined as much, such as albacore tuna or skipjack, for example, yellowfin tuna, they haven't declined in range as much. Some haven't declined at all, because their abundance is still closer to what it originally was. The species that have declined most in range, bluefin tuna in the Atlantic, southern bluefin tuna in the South Pacific and South Indian Ocean, and white marlin of this coast are also the ones that we believe have declined most in abundance. So there seems to be a general relationship between range size and abundance, which we have on land, and the message is ocean predators are in no way different. And this is important because we have often thought about these very differently. We've imagined them to be somewhat extinction-proof because, well, they have produced lots more eggs, potentially more young, and they may have a higher ability to withstand exploitation. Well, these patterns suggest they may not be all that different. For relatively fast-growing species such as these scombrids or mackerel-like fish. By now in the talk, it should be clear what's the main driver of these changes. Clearly, the most prevalent driver, both historically and today, I would submit, is industrialized fishing, which has the ability to deplete these species over vast regions of their range. We didn't have that ability previously, say in the centuries prior to the 20th century. Depletion was often more localized to coastal or shelf area, whereas now there's really no limit to where we can go with new technology. But it's also important to recognize that this is exacerbated, particularly in coastal regions, by habitat destruction, pollution, and increasingly everywhere in the ocean by climate change. For example, there is good evidence that the plankton ecosystem, which sustains everything at higher trophic level, has been changing greatly over the last 100 years or so. And this has impacts for fisheries. So what does the future hold? This is from a wonderful paper by Keith Brander about climate change and fisheries and how they interact. And I would submit that climate in fishing, or climate change rather in fishing, produces kind of sandwiches marine ecosystems in the middle, causing changes at the top and the bottom of the food chain that interact in ways that we don't really understand well. And I think we better figure this out quickly because it's changing as we study it. The marine ecosystem, but also the fish stocks embedded in them. So to give you just one example from the North Sea, which is really well documented, in the North Sea, obviously fishing pressure is too high, exploitation rate is too high, because partly so many countries are involved in fishing those resources. There's used to be a lot of illegal fishing, it's clamped down a bit now. But certainly the stocks are very depleted, particularly the major brownfish species. At the same time as that happened, climate warming has changed the plankton ecosystems in a way that are less favorable for some of the fish larvae, for example, cod, which is greatly depleted, so it has low recruitment to start with, and then the survival of those recruits is impaired by changes in the plankton ecosystems that are not beneficial to the survival of that species. So that, again, creates a double problem that we need to be aware of in managing those fish stocks. So much for the first part. So this is changes in biodiversity, both spatially and temporally. What are the consequences of this? These are the linkages in my initial diagram. So I talked much about impact so far. Now we're talking more about linkages within the ecosystem. This is a well-publicized graph by Daniel Pauly. It's a bit of a cartoon, and it's not true everywhere, but I think it captures in a very accessible way some of the changes we're seeing. As fishing intensifies over time, we see a loss, particularly of large faunas. Large sharks are among the first to decline in abundance because they're very vulnerable to even light fishing pressure. Some of the larger tuna and billfish, some of the larger groundfish, rockfish, for example. And we're left with a simplified ecosystem often that's dominated by smaller fishes and plankton. Also, due to the habitat impacts of fishing, we often see a simplification of bottom habitats. Diversity often decreases over time, not always. Sometimes we see changes in diversity that are unrelated to fishing, for example, where the climate is changing and we have southern species invading, such as right here in Narragansett Bay. Ecosystems become less resilient, meaning less able to absorb shocks, changes, stresses in the system, less predictable, which is important for users of ocean resources, because if you want to have a business plan, you need predictability, you need some stability. And that's often lost to some extent. And they're also less productive often, because some of the species that sustain productivity are impaired in their abundance, maybe in their range. We published a paper a few years ago where we tried to understand how that loss of diversity is exactly, we tried to document kind of those linkages between loss of diversity and some of these things we care about. So this was one aspect of that study. It actually looked at 4 different aspects of change. I'm just grabbing this one because it's maybe the one most easy to relate to. This shows actually the mean of 12 coastal ecosystems including Chesapeake Bay, for example, the North Sea, Galveston Bay, the Bay of Fundy in Canada. Ecosystems that are well studied, well understood, and that also tend to range at the high end of human impacts due to high population densities. And you see that a large number of species is depleted, meaning they're at least 50% lost in their abundance, or even collapsed, meaning they've lost at least 90% of their abundance, or they're actually extinct. 7% of species in those ecosystems were not found there anymore. This mostly includes commercial species and species that we know about. There's a large number of species where we simply don't know their fate. And then the good news is that some of them have recovered over time. So they were depleted at one point and started to recover again. What this overall loss of biodiversity has done, it has reduced the number of viable fisheries, species that are actually still there to be exploited, the amount of nursery habitat that sustains those fish stocks, and maybe most importantly, the ability of those ecosystems to maintain water quality by filtering out wastes and detoxifying. And what that has done in turn, it has increased risks for coastal inhabitants, both human and non-human, including beach closures, harmful blooms, fish kills, oxygen depletion, coastal flooding due to coastal habitats such as wetlands, and an increase in species invasions. This is on a large scale, so some of these changes are quite substantial. A simple example of this comes from Chesapeake Bay, where very large amounts of oysters were removed over the previous to that century. And this has contributed, it hasn't caused, but it has contributed, we think, to the emergence of algae blooms, some of them toxic, in that estuary and in other estuaries, due to increased land runoff and pollution, but also to a loss of the filter function that could counter that human effect. So again, you have this double jeopardy where you're doing two things at the same time, and their combined impacts may cause, or at least accelerate, the occurrence of these algae blooms. Another consequence that's well documented is the loss of viable fishery. As I said, we looked at those 12 coastal ecosystems, but also globally. This is all the fish stocks in the world from FAO catch data. These are two different independent estimates of the percent of fisheries that are not viable anymore. You may call them depleted, collapsed. FAO calls them senescent. And the best estimate is somewhere between a quarter and a third of fisheries today that are in that category, where they're not producing anything resembling the previous yield, either because they've collapsed in abundance or they're under very restricted management to prevent their collapse. There's a long-term trend to this, and I think it's upon us to change the direction of that trend and to turn it around into the right direction and to focus entirely on recovery as the main target of fisheries and marine management, the unifying theme that could drive this trend into a different direction. And I want to illustrate that with this simple scenario. This is again a different analysis that looked at the amount of seafood that's available per person on the planet. So this is partly driven by what's available, what's caught, given the effort we put into global fisheries, and then also obviously the number of people. And what we see is that this was increasing over much of the record, and then it turned around sometime in the late 80s because global fisheries catches peaked out, and they didn't increase anymore after that. Although even at that time, the FAO predicted that we would easily reach 200 million tons of wild catches by the year 2000, which was simply an extrapolation of what had been achieved in the past. But probably at that time, we reached a global limit in a sense, the biodiversity that is available for sustaining global fisheries, and it has been going downhill since then. If we would continue this trend, we would reach low levels of seafood available per person. But there's other scenarios. We could stabilize this trend, or we could even recover. We could help marine resources to rebound in a way to support those fisheries again. So that's what the third part of my talk will be about choosing our future. Choosing our future because, as we're in the driver's seat by analogy, we have a choice. We can go into different directions. And I think it's pretty clear in which direction we want to steer. The tricky part is, how do we do it? And how do we get enough people interested in this to actually help out? Because I think it needs a whole lot of people. You can't just leave this to a handful of managers overseeing those resources, because they're under the pressure from industry, vested interest, that want to continue business as usual. So I think there needs to be a groundswell of support for a different vision of managing the oceans and turning those trends around. This is actually being done in some regions, and one of them happens to be right here off Rhode Island. It's a success story. It's not a complete success story. There's not everything great, but some things, some important things are improving in areas like Georges Bank. So this is just picking out one species, which has become a bit of a poster child for recovery. It's the Georges Bank haddock, which is an important fishery, obviously, and which collapsed due to foreign overfishing mostly in the late 1960s. Then it was put under restrictive management, partly because the US, as other countries at that time, established a 200-mile limit that basically eliminated a lot of the fishing going on by foreigners. The species started to recover. Then the US, as other countries, Canada, for example, invested into, overcapitalized the domestic fleet that then just repeated the errors that have been performed before. The stock went to a new low level in abundance. At this time in history, stocks, groundfish stocks, including haddock, cod, halibut, and others, all along the Canadian Atlantic coast collapsed to very low abundance. So I believe that had some effect on the management of this species, as there was an emergency closure of half of the fishing grounds in order to aid their recovery. And it worked basically the next year. Since then, biomass has been increasing steadily, time high, the highest in the time series. And catches lagged somewhat behind, but as the species increased, catches also are now at levels higher than they have been since the early 80s. With the difference that these catches are sustainable, whereas these catches weren't, because the species at that time was declining, whereas now it's increasing. This closure had positive effects not just on haddock, but also on several flounder species, on scallops, and probably on bottom habitats that sustain these species. So it's a success story. There are some species on Georges Bank that are not increasing. Cod, for example, is increasing, if only very slowly. It's a general theme, however, that wherever you protect sensitive areas and you eliminate fishing, at least from some of those regions, you see those increases happening. And they're not only for single species. Here, this is again from this paper looking at the linkage between biodiversity change and ecosystem functions and services. And what we saw there is that, consistent with theory, when we reverse the trend, we see an increase in species richness in these protected areas, an increase in the taxa that can be fished, that sustain fisheries, an increase in the catch per unit effort around the reserve, about 4 times increase here, an increase in the catch. These are two different statistical estimates of weighing the different studies against each other. We see an increase in stability, resistance improves, recovery after the disturbance improves, and the overall variability, the ups and downs, the bounds and leaps in the biomass of species decreases, which is what we want. We want a more predictable system to work with. And then finally, there's non-extracted services that are increasing. This was data from 138 protected areas in the Caribbean that saw large increases in tourism after they were implemented. So one important caveat to this solution to some of the biodiversity crisis we see unfolding in the ocean is that it's not done, you can't solve this by protecting parts of the ocean and simply displacing fishing effort and other activities, mind you, to other parts of the ocean, which then experience not decreasing but increasing pressure on their biodiversity. So there has to be a way to embed these protected areas, which could be drivers of recovery in some regions, into a larger framework of reducing exploitation rate and addressing these other threats. And that was part of this working group that Jeremy alluded to, that he and I were participating in at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, where we looked at the track record of rebuilding fisheries and some of the ways on how this can be done. And I'm a huge fan of this graph. I will explain it to you, and I hope you stay with me. It's a tiny bit complex, but I think it's really important to understand this. It's actually a courtesy of Jeremy, who came up with this model. So what this shows is exploitation rate on the bottom. Exploitation rate is simply the proportion of the resource we take out every year. So 0.2 would be 20% taken out every year. Then we plot the response of various metrics to changes in exploitation rate. So the harder we fish here, the more we catch, up to a certain point, after which the stocks become so depleted that catches actually have to decrease as well. So it's an optimum function, and we can define this optimum point here, not just for single species, but for the entire ecosystem. That's called multi-species maximum sustainable yield, where we theoretically can get the highest catch. Above we overfish, and below we can rebuild. So this is, if you simply have the fisheries perspective, it's clear what to do, and it's enshrined in legislation all around the world. This is what we're steering towards, the sustainable yield for multiple species. Yet, this comes at a cost, and this is what people like myself have been studying, the extent of that cost. Changes in the size spectrum of the fish community, a loss of the large fish, or at least a depletion of larger fish, such as the bluefin tuna, large sharks, and so on. And also a decline in the total biomass of species in the system. So you get less and smaller fish as you reach that theoretical optimum point of maximum sustainable yield. And from a conservation perspective, it's most striking that you also see an increasing number of species, this is a fairly steeply increasing function, collapse to low biomass, meaning they are less of 10% of their abundance, which would actually qualify them under terrestrial legislation to be listed as critically endangered under endangered species legislation. So very strong protection measures would have to be implemented to recover these species. Yet under the normal target of fisheries management, we would buy this at a cost of maybe between 30 or 40% of species collapse to low biomass. So there's a trade-off here between reaching maximum fisheries benefits from a simple yield perspective and the impacts you're having on the ecosystem. And I think this graph's really beautifully capturing pretty much everything we've been studying about changes in the ocean due to fishing. There's other things going on too, but the effects of fishing are beautifully encapsulated here. So this was the old target. It's in United Nations legislation, the law of the sea. It's in the US legislation previous to the Stevens Act, which now doesn't see this as a target anymore, but more so as a limit. So you want to steer below the maximum yield target, because this is a safer place to be. Because we've learned that in reality, if we postulate this as a target, there's uncertainty around it, and that uncertainty is often interpreted in such a way that we're steering above the target. So the reality was that overfishing was widespread, and this is not a trade-off anymore. This has negative impacts on the fishery, on the species, on size and biomass. So nobody's happy. So the idea is to move away from that reality, go back on the catch curve, and set a new target, which would allow rebuilding of species across the board. Note that there's still some species predicted to be collapsed even under this new target. So other measures would have to bring this number of collapsed species down. For example, changes in the fishing gear or spatial management, where you have some sensitive areas completely protected so they can fully recover to their original biomass and size structure, and all the species could be present there. Some of those species that would collapse even under low fishing pressure would include large sharks, for example. So that's the idea, to move away from the old target and the old reality and be somewhere here. And it just so happens that this fishing conservation sweet spot, as Steve Palumbi has called it, also happens to coincide well with what's called maximum economic yield, where fishing is actually most profitable, because there's an abundance of fish around that requires very little effort to catch them. So your cost is going down, profits are going up. So that's the idea. And under this new target, in this particular model, which actually also happens to represent roughly the Georges Bank ecosystem, you would only sacrifice about 10%, 15% of the maximum, the potential maximum yield from that community. So it comes at a relatively low cost with enormous benefits, both ecologically and economically. And I've been showing this to a lot of audiences over the last half year or so. And I just find it really encapsulates well where we have to move towards and why. There's a little catch to that, is when you, and it has again to do with the displacement issue. Same as when you displace fishing effort from marine reserves to areas that are still fished. You could, if you address overfishing in those other areas as well, you could displace fishing effort or fleets to just other parts of the globe where there's maybe less political support for marine conservation, less capacity for enforcement, maybe even corruption, less scientific capacity, and so on. So these are areas like Africa, which really, really, really need the fish that occurs in their waters to sustain their population. Yet what we see in reality is that fishing effort from some of those countries that are making positive changes, including the European Union, is being displaced into West Africa and more recently East Africa, where it's pretty much a wild west of fisheries. Same goes on the high seas. Fisheries on the high seas are probably more regulated by economic factors than any ecological or conservation considerations. So that's clearly something that needs to change because this is simply a bad idea. So I'm coming more towards solutions and trying to highlight just conceptually some of the aspects of a new framework for ocean management that would successfully reverse some of those changes we've been documenting. One important one that I didn't appreciate until recently is realigning incentives. There is actually it's not a mystery that we're overfishing because the incentive structure economically is such that it encourages overfishing. We're moving away from it, but aspects of it are still there. For example, harmful subsidies that encourage overcapitalization, fleet modernization, expansion of fleets, and so on. Then the open access nature of fishery has been identified as a major driver. This is such that if there's a race to whoever gets the most fish is the winner, given a certain quota, and it simply depends on how hard you fish, whether you own a big share of the quota or a small share of the quota. That's been seen as a major driver of non-compliance and of also resisting efforts to reduce fishing effort and rebuild. And one solution that addresses that problem is to have property rights introduced where people have a guaranteed share of the catch. Not in tonnage, but in percentage of whatever the quota is. So the quota still has to be established based on these precautionary principles I just outlined, but how it's allocated changes. And it changes in the way that people have planning stability and that their share actually becomes more valuable as the stock rebuilds, much as our share in a company becomes more valuable as the company expands. So the incentive is changed from fishing down to letting the fish stocks rebuild. And in some areas like New Zealand, for example, this has had notable successes in changing, if only the tone in discussions between fishery managers and fisher folks, because catch shares actually encourage people to support measures aimed at rebuilding stocks. We need to reinvest some of the resources we have sunken into harmful subsidies, into rebuilding programs, and this includes improving ocean governance, transparency, and enforcement, not just in this country, but abroad. Again, I think it's important to recognize that the US is importing not half, but fully 3/4 of their seafood. So even if we do a good job in this country, we're contributing to vast problems in other regions that may be even less able to deal with those problems because of their reduced capacity for enforcement and governance. So improving this not just in our own backyard, but kind of encouraging the same standards to be met elsewhere, I think is a critical aspect of improving our dealings with the ocean. And then this talk wouldn't be complete without talking about stupid, wasteful, and immoral practices, such as shark finning, which reduce small parts of the fish, dump the carcass, sometimes still alive, for luxury markets that don't feed people, that benefit very few individuals, that make tons of money off it, and then endangered species that can least sustain any amount of fishing pressure, such as large pelagic sharks, for example, which are now, according to the IUCN, among the most endangered groups of animals on the planet. Fully 2/3 of pelagic sharks are thought to be threatened with extinction. And this is in no small part due to the luxury market in shark fins. Finally, this talk wouldn't be complete if I wouldn't bring it back to each and every one of us. So there's programs like the Seafood Watch program by Monterey Bay Aquarium. There's many others. This is one I happen to know about, and I think this is well run, well researched, and credible, where you can download off the web today these Seafood Watch cards. You can even get them on your cell phone if you prefer that, and be able to make knowledgeable, informed, and conscious decisions about whether you contribute to a growing problem or to the solutions that are there for us to enforce and to implement. So let me wrap up. The bottom line is we're facing an ongoing loss of marine biodiversity. I believe that this loss, despite the good efforts in some countries such as the United States, parts of Europe, parts of Oceania, are still on a global scale increasing, that this affects things we really care about, such as the supply of food to our growing populations, water quality, the resilience of ecosystems, their ability to absorb other stresses that are occurring at the same time, such as climate change, ocean acidification, and so on. The restoration of marine biodiversity through a range of measures that are enmeshed and tailored to a particular situation, such as the Georges Bank example, where they not only protected half of the banks from fishing for a while, they also reduced fishing effort. They addressed, they changed the fishing gear around in some cases, such as there's less bycatch of cod, for example. A range of measures to affect the restoration of biodiversity. And finally, the bottom line that it's our actions, and equally important, our inactions, that determine the future of ocean life on this planet. So I would like to thank my collaborators and friends at the Centers of Marine Life at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis at Dalhousie Universities, our funders, and finally you for spending some time with me tonight. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. If you'd like to, can you hear me? Okay. I guess I don't need a microphone. If you'd like to ask questions, raise your hand. A person with a microphone will come calling you. It's nice if you want to introduce yourself and try to, keep it to asking questions which can be answered rather than making speeches. Okay? If you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll try to identify. Okay, right here.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the catch share as opposed to the quota system.
Oh, okay.
So could you explain that more clearly?
Yeah, it's a little complex. So the catch share is not an alternative to the quota system. So there's a quota either way. The catch share is a different way of allocating. So a lot of fisheries are open access, so people can come in and drop out of the fishery, and the quota is, if you want, a total quota for what can be extracted that particular year. Say it's 100,000 tons of cod. And then individual operators determine by their effort how much of that quota they catch. In a catch share program, there's limited entry in that there's only so many permits basically given out for people to share that catch. And those could be individuals, but they could also be fishing communities, cooperatives, other entities, corporations. And there could be a cap on how much of that can be owned by one person. Much like shares in a company, you have a cap on only 50% or so can be owned by a particular shareholder. And the idea is to have some stability for people, and also that they can determine when they fish, at what time they fish, and how much effort they invest over a given year, and that they don't have to compete with other fishermen for who gets the most catch that particular year, because they have a fixed share, and they can also sell that share, much like a share in the company, to another fisherman. They can also lease it out. And the higher the fish stock, the more worth the share. So a good example comes from New Zealand. The lobster fishery there was in decline, and they transferred it to a catch share program. And it so happened that one particular area was particularly bad. So the catch shares there on the market, when you would buy one of those shares, were not worth very much. And the fishermen who owned them held on to them because they wouldn't gain much from trading them in. Whereas in other regions where the stocks were doing better, the share was worth 5 times what it was in this particular region. So what happens is there was an incentive for rebuilding, which did happen. The stock increased, fishing pressure was kept down, and the share price went up to what it was everywhere else. So individual fishermen made basically 5-folded their asset within a few years by supporting these conservation measures. So that's the basic idea. It's often a misconception that it would be instead of quotas, or that then fishermen or operators could determine how much they fish at free will. That's not the case. The quota is still set based on good science.
Thank you. Regarding your diagram of the declining seafood supply per capita, I think, I agree that that's probably declining in terms of the wild capture fisheries, but it's actually going up due to aquaculture and worldwide. And so I acknowledge that aquaculture has done some bad things to the environment. I also acknowledge that aquaculture is trying to make itself a lot better. And I'm just wondering whether you perceive aquaculture to be part of the problem or part of the solution.
It's a bit of both. And again, those seafood cards actually encapsulate that, because what they're telling you is that not every wild fishery is the same. There are some wild fisheries that are contributing to a problem, such as bluefin tuna, for example, and there's others that contribute to a solution by rewarding fisheries that have been sustainably managed, for example, Alaska salmon. Then also aquaculture species on those lists, the full range of species you see in seafood stores, some of which are grown using sustainable methods by and large, as much as we can tell. For example, they're not polluting the environment, they're not relying on wild capture fisheries to feed farmed fish. And then you have others that are more contributing to problems by introducing diseases in the marine environment, dumping pollutants in there and so on, contributing to coastal eutrophication, such as farmed salmon, for example, in many regions. So it's just empowering people, giving them a choice in both for aquaculture and for wild fisheries. So there are wild fisheries, to answer your questions, which are a problem, and there are wild fisheries which are more of a solution. The same goes for aquaculture, I believe.
I'm pretty loud.
Okay, belt it out.
Just for my question is twofold. One, I had a sushi restaurant where a aquaculture raised bluefin tuna was being sold. I guess it was raised at some university in Japan.
Okay.
And the other is just thinking about terrestrial animals and how growth in captivity and then release has then helped to booster a population like the black-footed ferrets that were nearing extinction.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you could talk about maybe aquaculture bluefin tuna or large predators or perhaps growth in captivity and release, because that we see that help marine animals the same way we've seen it help terrestrial animals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Everybody got that question? So one thing I'm struck by is that I think in the marine environment we have much less control. So in terrestrial environments, it's pretty straightforward to raise a species in captivity. Well, it's more straightforward than it is in the ocean. In the ocean, there's actually very few attempts. Very few successful attempts. There's a lot of failed attempts in trying to boost fish stocks, often anonymous fishes, through captive breeding programs, which have caused a lot of problem with genetic pollution and other problems. In some cases, it has had a benefit, but in most cases, I would submit it has created more problems than benefits and has detracted from the primary method of rebuilding these species, which is due to less exploitation. I think it's been tried as a bit of an alternative to addressing the hard problem, which is high exploitation rates, and just trying to subsidize those imperiled populations by captive breeding, for example, hatchery programs and so on. And I think there's very little evidence that that has worked. And I think that's partly because we understand so much less about those environments. Once the fish are released, we often have no clue where they're going, what they're doing, who eats them, how they behave, all of these things. With black-footed ferrets, you can just go out and look. In the ocean, it's a lot more difficult.
Question over there on the side. Oh,
Hi. Oh, there was a picture you had up there, and I don't really know what it was about. It was like a circle, and it said marine ecosystem in it.
Can you say, articulate that again?
It was like, it had a circle that said marine ecosystem in it.
Yes.
I just need an explanation of it, because I don't know what it's about.
Do you refer to this one?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah. Okay, I may have glossed over that a little bit. So what this is it's trying to conceptualize how changes in climate and our activities with respect to fishing may interact in driving change in the marine ecosystems, and what are the linkages that we actually know about. So we know that fishing impacts the ecosystem and also impacts individual fish stocks. Fish stocks usually a little bit stronger than individual ecosystems. And also what the fish stocks are doing is affecting the fishing activity back. So it's a feedback loop, it's an interaction. And then also climate affects fish stocks, but it also affects the ecosystem in which the fish stocks are embedded. Each fish, this is something I sometimes dwell on when I dig into my fillet of Georges Bank haddock, for example, all the other species that went into making that fish. All those species that provided habitat for the juvenile haddock to live in, all the species that fed it, different species that fed it during its subadult and adult stage. There's an enormous number of species that go into making that haddock. So the marine ecosystem cannot be separated from the fish stock it supports. So the effects that climate has on the ecosystem as well as on the fish stocks both interact in this way that one is embedded in the other. And also there's a little arrow here which says that what happens in the marine ecosystem also affects to some extent what happens in climate. So, for example, the formation of the MSP, which is the volatile compound that acts in cloud formation, affects the albedo, the reflective surface of the ocean, and the atmosphere above it, and changes how strongly that ocean warms over time. So there are some feedbacks between climate and the marine ecosystem. The biological pump of phytoplankton absorbing carbon dioxide, 40%, 45% of what we emit ends up in the ocean and gets transported into the deep sea where it remains for a few hundred, maybe even 1,000 years. So those are just some of the linkage between fishing and climate. And we're changing all of these things around. The goal is to understand how and how we can minimize harmful impacts.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi. I was just wondering, when you were talking about banning shark finning, how we can do much about it because much of it happens outside of the U.S. and because it is so profitable for the people who engage it, how would be the best way to go about getting it banned?
Well, one thing is write to your congressman or Senate representative, because there is a bill I'm not sure it has passed through Senate yet. I think it's still in the Senate about strengthening shark finning regulations in the US. Because still shark fins can be retained and sold legally in the US and also traded. And there is an effort to even remove that because once the fins are off, you can't tell whether they were taken from a shark that was landed or they're part of this illegal shark finning practice. And there's definitely illegal shark finning going on, for example, in Hawaii, but also where I live in Nova Scotia. In our region, it's probably not of a large extent, but it's still there. So efforts to strengthen those laws. Some countries have opted for completely banning any shark fishing, shark finning, export of shark fins, recognizing that those sharks are worth more alive than dead or finned. Those are particular countries who have a vibrant tourism industry, dive industry, such as the Maldives, Palau, French Polynesia, and Ecuador most recently. So I think by just voicing your concern and making it an issue that's talked about, I think is an important part. Same goes for the ivory trade, right? I mean, most of us are not consumers of ivory. It's something we feel we couldn't do much about, but political pressure by the U.S. and other countries has led to against the there was not anonymous support for this, but it has led to a CITES listing for elephants in the late 1980s, which has actually saved that species from extinction and contributed to its recovery. The same thing right now is going on in Doha for bluefin tuna and also for some of the most endangered shark species, coincidentally. So things are being done, and I think it's a matter of whether we're plugged into those kind of developments or whether we're just standing by the side and letting it happen in whatever way it's happening. And I think the more people are thinking about it and making it heard that it's an issue that affects them, I think we're on the right track then.